Granblue Fantasy Relink is a fascinating mix of ideas, all done in interesting ways. It's a game that takes inspiration from many other types of games and combines it all into this one big mix that sacrifices some elements of all those things that inspire it, but it still manages to deliver on the essence of them while creating its own unique formula that takes advantage of gameplay design and feedback systems from everywhere, including gacha games, to create something that's very satisfying. But it can also be very frustrating, repetitive, and feel like it has a crisis in design, as it manages to implement many ideas from other games and genres in ways that are really interesting to see together, but it doesn't really take advantage of them, neither individually nor in combination, and some of those elements it takes from different places also end up clashing with the game. It also has an absurdly bloated grind, requiring many different progression systems that almost never overlap, and with many of them requiring you to engage in gameplay that is not only repetitive, but also some of the least engaging you could ever play, coming close to barely doing anything. And these are required in order to progress at endgame. And for as many ideas it takes from other games, it very rarely does anything to innovate or improve on those things it takes, when I believe that a game like this is the golden opportunity to do so. The end result is a game with a lot to offer, and tremendous potential. When it's firing on all cylinders, it's not only fun, but something that really pushes new design philosophies in games, specifically when it comes to player feedback. But it's also a game that tries very hard, very often, to keep you away from where it shines the best, or rarely rewards you for playing the best parts of it. So hey, welcome, I'm Mug Thief, and this is my big analysis of Granblue Fantasy Relink. There will be potential gameplay spoilers in the footage shown, but there will be spoiler tags for when I talk about the endgame surprises, where there's some of the best stuff in the game. But I will be showing everything up to that moment in the footage without spoiler tags. So if you want to go in 100% blind, consider listening to this video instead, since for many people, what monsters are actually in the game is a big part of the surprise. And if at any point you think that what I'm saying is interesting, please hit the like button. It helps the video reach more people. Let's get into it. Granblue Fantasy Relink can be divided into 3 different parts: its story campaign, its post-game progression, and its endgame grind. When it comes to its gameplay, it can also be broken into 3 different parts, since one of it is a character action game, think something like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, another part is a Monster Hunter style quest and farming system, and the third part relates to its boss design, which is more similar to an action RPG or an MMO, where enemies have standard telegraphed areas to stand in or avoid, and small mini-objectives necessary to overcome the mechanics the bosses present. If you wanted to look at all of this from a negative perspective, it's a game that can be described by a list of other games and then subtracting things from them. It has that story progression and level design of something like Bayonetta, but its combat is not as deep. It has the multiplayer structure and character progression of Monster Hunter, but the bosses aren't infinitely replayable and the grind can be worse. Its story, while probably more interesting to those invested in the franchise, feels like a decent to pretty good fantasy anime story with some Final Fantasy style trappings. It doesn't set the world on fire, it doesn't come close to the best that Final Fantasy puts out, but if you like that sort of stuff, you'll enjoy what's here, even though there aren't any moments to cry about or anything to remember for decades to come. Except the music. The music is really, really good. You can't argue with me on that. But describing Relink in this way does the game a disservice, because it manages to pull off something that I think is always commendable. It's more interesting than the sum of its parts. It's something I recently encountered playing Palworld that also proves that taking inspiration from many places can lead to great results when done with a clear vision. And Granblue does so with its own style, its own charming if sometimes grating cast of characters, its own very, very satisfying gameplay that can draw you in enough to spend hundreds of hours, with an endgame loop that is carefully designed to keep you hooked like an addict, attempting to increase every number of damage just a bit more. It can keep you hooked on attempting to roll for one or more ultra-rare pieces of gear and having fun for a large amount of it, especially at the true endgame. And it ultimately ends up being a great game that fulfills something I've always wanted. The cool designs and characters of all these massive gacha games, but put into a game that lets me enjoy it all with gameplay systems I like more, and without the gacha. That's an important part for me. But as you can probably already tell, this game is big and complex, especially when viewed from a design perspective, and talking about all of its features is a bit of a daunting task. But I'm going to do my best to keep things organized, so we're going to look at all 3 parts of the progression and the 3 parts of its gameplay in a chronological order as the game presents them to a player. There is good and bad in mostly all of them, with some being mostly good or bad, and one in particular being almost exclusively bad. And in a majority, my opinion on Relink is highly positive. There's a lot to like in this game, but there is a lot to criticize as well. So if this video ever sounds to you like I'm hating on the game, I'm not. I'm analyzing it to determine where it could be better, precisely because I like it so much that I want it to be. So let's begin at the start, with the story, or the campaign if you prefer to call it that. The 10-hour-long storyline has been one of the major points of surprise towards the game, but I think it stems from a misunderstanding of what this game tries to do. This isn't a massive action JRPG with a 40 to 50 hour storyline, something like Trials of Mana or Tales of Arise. This isn't an open world or a semi-open world game where you take on side quests and spend hours talking to NPCs and soaking in the world. You shouldn't have those expectations, but I would understand your disappointment if that is what you wanted from it. This is a Devil May Cry or Bayonetta-inspired 10-hour campaign that transitions into a repeatable quest structure grind that's similar to an MMO, or more accurately, Monster Hunter. The basic gist of the game is that you're a group of sky adventurers on your skyship, not very dissimilar to something like One Piece, since the crew goes from one sky island cluster to another, embarking on adventures in different lands while taking down primeval beasts, which are very similar to primals or the summons from the Final Fantasy series. In this game, an adventure takes its twists and turns, leading the crew to battle it out with some strong foes, and you do so by progressing through a series of chapters and levels that feel very close to something out of a Platinum game, which, by the way, did initially work on this game. I'm not one to speculate on if this design is a relic of their work, or if it was always the vision, and that's why they were brought on to work on it, but the final result is undeniably a very Platinum-esque story. Each chapter goes through a series of encounters with enemies, some platforming, very slight optional puzzles with chests, some extra encounters to fight, and big boss fights towards the end. The levels do feel like proper action game levels, and not like stitched arenas, with areas designed exclusively as transitory spaces, leading to places where fights simply happen. No big show or obvious transition to a fighting space, and the entire campaign feels very polished. It's limited, is clearly not the main meat of the game, but a lot of effort and care has been put into it to make sure it doesn't feel like an afterthought, and instead feels like a selling point, something that gives the player value for their time and money, even if they chose to stop playing once reaching the end of it. It flows well, with some pacing issues here and there, since some of the missions that are meant to switch up the pacing are very fun, like piloting a mech for a few minutes, and others, like manning turrets, fall flat. And depending on who you are, you might encounter some difficulty spikes that require grinding to progress, and the story mode will then last you around 10 hours. Its more final conclusion will require you to play 10 to 20 more hours and take on more generic missions and Monster Hunter style quests to reach a point where you can take on the final story chapter. And it is worth mentioning that you could tone down the difficulty of the story and add assist modes and accessibility to play through it and even through the content leading to that real final ending, which I think are all smart touches if we consider that for many people this will be their first real game, because they might be coming from the mobile gacha game of Granblue. And this transition from the story to that quest hub is one of the first and very particular things about Relink, because this switch into a very different type of game is one that I think most players will enjoy or have no issue with in the worst case, but it's still a bit of a shock to the system. Granblue does so many things that despite here becoming this menu where you choose a boss fight and jump into a multiplayer match to take bosses down, the story left me feeling like it could have also been a longer story mode. And it could have also been repurposed into a Vermintide or Left 4 Dead style repeatable mission structure in multiplayer, for example. And it could have not had that Monster Hunter progression. Or it could have done that multiplayer style while retaining that progression. Or a million other possibilities. But instead, it just does away with this mission structure altogether and jumps full on into that Monster Hunter low rank, high rank, and master rank progression with everything that it entails. But it doesn't do so very well during this second part of the game, especially because the Monster Hunter-inspired quest counters and progression is just a tad bit frustrating and disappointing. And we are specifically talking about the progression to what you could call Master Rank, not Master Rank itself. So make no mistake, this is straight out of Capcom's series. You go to a quest counter, select a quest, load into it in multiplayer or single player, beat it, and receive a series of rewards and drops depending on your performance. You don't need to eat or restock potions before going out, but when you return, you spend your rewards on upgrading your character and your weapons, and you repeat this to become stronger and take on more difficult quests. Instead of choosing a weapon and an armor set, you choose one of the 19 characters. They all play in that character action style, with universal things like dodges, but all 19 of them are very distinct, and while not as deep as Monster Hunter, for reasons we'll talk about later, and not as deep as Devil May Cry because the movesets are just not that deep or technically demanding, they all hit a very good middle ground of depth and simplicity. Instead of armor skills, you have sigils, which we will also talk a lot more about later, but you can draw analogs to the series if you're familiar with it, and understand much of the systems in Granblue, comparing them to Monster Hunter. I think that up to here, we're all on board, but there's a lot of stuff here that simply doesn't work. Some of it unique to this game, and some of it worse versions of problems that exist in Monster Hunter. The first point of frustration unique to Relink comes from the fact that when playing single player, you are not alone. When it comes to quests, you can go out by yourself, but there's no point beyond challenge runs for personal reasons, and enemy health doesn't scale depending on the number of party members. And if you tried to go by yourself during progression, it'll make some things almost impossible. What you're meant to do is always choose a party of 4, with you controlling one character and the others being AI companions. And this is where the third part of the game comes into play, because we've talked about the character action and the Monster Hunter progression and general skeleton, but the enemies you face are very different from what you'd find in either Monster Hunter or Bayonetta. And to me, they resemble MMO bosses, and in my personal experience, those you'd find in Final Fantasy XIV. This includes gimmicks and mechanics for each fight, along with the telltale structure of the bosses becoming nigh invincible when reaching a certain health value, and beginning said mechanics in a scripted fashion. Many mechanics in the game benefit from cooperation. Contrary to the systems you might find in Monster Hunter or Wild Hearts, in Granblue, the fights, as well as some of the roles and flowcharts of the characters, imitate an MMO. You have enemies like Vulcan Bola and Excavalion, which have phases that are cleared faster by having the party split up to take on different things around the arena. And if you're attempting to progress through the game solo, these will be the moments that most hammer home the fact that if your party members are not properly leveled and progressed, they will be practically useless, leaving you in situations where the consequences of these mechanics spiral and wipe your party. If you are majorly overleveled and overpowered, it won't matter, but when progressing through the game, it does. The AI companions otherwise do a good job, but they require grinding and leveling up as much as your main character choice, making solo progression similar to attending disco nights at the geriatric facility, a very slow and awkward grind that you didn't expect. In other fights that don't have mechanics like these, what you'll encounter is that they are very slow if your party is slightly underleveled, or a straight-up liability that can make you lose if they are noticeably underleveled. And in endgame, the mechanics go from things that are possible if you're overleveled to things that require the cooperation of a whole team. And of course, none of this is a problem if you're playing online, where all your party members will probably be strong enough to hold their own and also have a human making decisions. But this problem will become worse and worse as time goes on. Progressing solo in this game is not fun, since that requirement of keeping your whole party up to a standard might lead to you farming for quite a while, and you might be doing so to power up characters that you don't care about. And on the contrary, if you simply play online, you never have to do any of this. And over time, as people move on from it or are exclusively in the highest level missions, you'll be forced to progress solo more. And it can even be felt right now, where earlier missions in high rank are really hard to get going in matchmaking. There is a quick quest system, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't fill in empty parties looking for a quest. It just matches 4 people and assigns a quest. But its rewards aren't even all that useful once you're at endgame. So obviously the game wants you to play online, and the experience for people who don't want to do that is not as good. But the online matchmaking is not particularly good. I feel like a lot of this sounds very negative, by the way, and let me be clear. If you can get through this and get into a match when you're playing the game with other people online, yeah, I'll have complaints, but the experience is excellent. It is a fun, addicting game that does so many things right. But we'll get into a lot of the great stuff later. Right now, matchmaking itself can be garbage. I've had some miserable 20-minute wait times to clear progression quests with matchmaking constantly resetting. The matchmaking in itself as a system is not good. I'm not talking about finding matches. I'm talking about its design. When looking to join a quest, you select it and then begin searching. You are locked into this. You cannot move, you can't check menus, you can't do anything. You stand still and wait until it either succeeds or fails, which takes about a minute. If it fails, you're thrown into a temporary multiplayer session, which also prohibits you from moving while matchmaking. But every minute or so, you have to press the X button to retry when the menu pops up. This makes it very tedious to leave the game open waiting to matchmake, since you have to constantly retry. But your other option might be to spend hours grinding to make other characters strong enough to do the quest in single player. So, instead, you keep waiting. If you play a quest in multiplayer and fail, even if 3 of the 4 players want to try again, it doesn't matter. The party will be disbanded instead of sticking together and searching for another player, something that hurts a lot more when you've been waiting for 30 minutes just to get a shot at a quest. Even when things work, because of how scaling is in the game, if you're not at endgame, you'll probably be paired up with max level players anyways, making the quest sometimes less than a minute long, even when doing some of the highest Maniac and Proud mode difficulty quests. Many can be less than a minute and are used for grinding and farming basic materials or money, and others can be around 3 to 5 minutes, except the most difficult ones, which are around 8 to 10 minutes when done at the recommended level, and clearly the ones the game wants you to grind and perfect the most. When you're spamming quests that are this short and have this very long, clunky matchmaking, it makes much of the experience feel like a cumbersome waste of time. So let's be thankful, I guess, that you don't have to eat and restock before going on quests. And the reason these quests are so short is because of their design. As much as the wrapper surrounding these quests is that of a Monster Hunter game, the quests themselves are not, and that doesn't mean that they're bad. I think that they're fun, and there are systems on systems with depth and intricacy in combat and in upgrading to keep the loop interesting. But I ultimately think that these types of missions don't work as well in a game like this. For starters, the actual quest types can vary, and while most people are here to farm and perfect the boss encounters, when hopping into something like the quick match system that just quickly pairs you up, you'll jump into defending the ship, but the ship has 2 turrets, so then 2 players just stand there for 3 minutes. You'll dash around collecting coins, you'll defend an area, or be tasked with killing as many monsters as possible in 4 minutes. And some of these quests even have great rewards, but they aren't engaging to play. When you do manually, or by luck, get into a boss quest, the bosses themselves become a speedrun, and this can be very fun, with you and more knowledgeable teammates knowing how to skip certain phases or break certain mechanics. But if you don't, the truth is that the fight will boil down to the same thing anyways, which is why I compare it to something like Final Fantasy XIV. Not in quality, by the way, just in how they work. The bosses will use a series of attacks. You damage them, you fill up their mode meter until they switch into the next phase, and then they have Bloodthirst, which is a moment when they greatly reduce the damage they take and go into traditional MMO mechanics. You'll have to dodge certain attacks by carefully positioning, jumping over things, constantly dodging in and out of different colored attack areas, whatever it may be, until the boss finishes and the fight resumes. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's basically a little bit of Mario Party in your boss battle. And while with the difficulty going up later, these mechanics also get tougher and more complex, they are always the same and happen at the same time every time you take on that boss. If you're a hunting aficionado, I'm sure this sounds very boring, because in Monster Hunter each fight can feel different and it requires a more traditional action game understanding of everything that the monster can do and everything that you can do in response to it. And that is one of the downsides to this repetitive nature of quests in Granblue Relink. But as a person with a lot of hours in Final Fantasy XIV, I must say that raiding can be an intensely fun experience, but the elements that make it intense and fun are not present in Relink, even though a lot of that design is. More importantly though is that when you make a system that imitates Monster Hunter but has the mechanics of an MMO, you're not really taking advantage of either system. This very predictable pattern that bosses take, those minigame style mechanics, are all made interesting in an MMO by how you press on when things don't go smoothly. MMOs are much more complex not only in playing each class, but also in how involved a fight can get with the required knowledge of each fight from each class and each role. Each person in a raid group has a very specific job, from correctly tanking to perfect positioning and rotation for DPS, or the adaptability of healers, and that entire dynamic is absent in Relink. Since the 19 characters you can play here imitate the playstyles of those roles, but not their actual responsibilities during a fight. Much of the fun from repeating those predictable fights comes from the investment required, the very real chance of failure, and the guarantee of great rewards at the end. And while Relink does scratch the itch, even more so at endgame, the stakes, requirements, and rewards are all lower, leading to a balance that isn't as good. I hate to boil it down in this way, but it really feels like MMO light boss design. But we'll talk much more in depth about this at endgame, where some of these problems really shine. For now, we really need to talk about playing as each of the characters. But before that, I want to remind you that you can subscribe to the channel. It's completely free and it helps me out. And that way you will never miss a video like this. If you're still not convinced you want to, don't worry, there's a lot of video left, so maybe by the end you'll be convinced. Anyways, let's explain a bit about how you actually play these 19 characters. Each character is unique, and they have their own mechanics and combos and things they want to do, but they all share the basics. You use X or square to attack, and Y or triangle to use your special thing, whatever it may be. Very often you will combine these two inputs, be it for traditional combos like pressing X 3 times and then Y, or holding Y to charge something, but these can all vary. You can dodge with invincibility frames, you can block, and you have perfect dodge and perfect parry. You also have 4 spell slots, which all work on cooldowns. All of the characters have 8 spells available, so those choices lead to build and gameplay diversity, as there are different utility and support spells, as well as damage dealing or self-buffs that take advantage of a character's unique mechanics. A great example to explain a character and what I mean regarding that MMO encounter and character design is Io, which is the elemental damage mage of the group. She has big damage spells, but they require long cast times, and a stacking mechanic to reach her biggest possible cast. Charging your normal attacks or using most of her spells will give her a stack, and at 3 stacks you can charge your big spell to maximum level. You also want to charge it after gaining a stack, since that gives you quick charge, making it faster, and you have spells that can instantly max your stacks. I think the archetype is very clear, and its intended game plan is very similar to an MMO rotation. You stand far away, charge up your stacks by cycling through your spells, and hit your big bang spells at the right time. As a person who mained Black Mage for a long time in Final Fantasy XIV, this was very easy to understand and highly appealing to me. Sure, this isn't an MMO, the rotations are much simpler, the fights are less strict, since you can continue charging your cast after dodging, for example, and optimization isn't that important. But a lot of the design of these characters adheres to things we've seen before, and that's not bad. Very rarely is there something new under the sun, and iteration is a part of innovation. Much of the feeling of playing a Black Mage is preserved when playing Io. You have the potential to do the most damage, but it's easy to do the least if you mess up. It's very punishing to drop a charge or a cast, and you really don't want to have enemies targeting you. And I even had a moment where every enemy had aggroed onto me in a fight because I was dealing the most damage, and I just kept running away in a deja vu of being mad at the tank for not properly retaining aggro and allowing me to do my thing. But that's when I remembered that this isn't the perfectly choreographed dance of an MMO raid. This is a 2-minute fight against a dragon where 4 people are each pressing their buttons to do their maximum damage combos in a DPS race. And don't get me wrong, that is fun and interesting. As much as these characters feel a certain way and the bosses remind me of a different game, that's not what this game is. It's not worse, it's just different, and it combines some really cool ideas into a new type of experience. What makes it worse is that it fails to capture the positives of those influences and shines by the merit of its combination and the success of being fun, flashy, and satisfying to play. And make no mistake, Relink is fun, responsive, diverse, has a very long treadmill to chase down if you enjoy chasing down treadmills, and I've had a blast playing it. But in its pursuit to combine these different styles of games together, it sacrifices a lot of what makes each of them so special. So let's talk about all of those gameplay systems. If we boil it all down, Relink combines the structure of Monster Hunter, where you repeat quests battling the same enemies to improve yourself, with the control style, pace, and trappings of a character action game like Bayonetta, or whatever other example you prefer, and the character, enemy, and class design of an RPG or an MMO. This is a dream come true for many people, but it doesn't quite pan out in reality, at least in this case. Just the idea of an RPG with a character action game is the reason that I was so excited for Final Fantasy XV. The reason I still am excited to play Final Fantasy XVI one day, although that might just be an action game from what I gather. It is the reason I'm excited for Dragon's Dogma 2 to an extent. Combining these things and then putting in Monster Hunter to fill in the gaps sounds like it should be a home run. But Relink leaves a lot of what makes those games pillars and masterpieces of gaming on the table. I already spoke about the matchmaking, which, as an important note, at the moment of this video's writing, does contain some sort of region lock. Changing your download region on Steam from the PC version will solve the issue, since choosing a more populated region or simply selecting Tokyo will give you instant queues. Not only that, but I've had perfect clears of the final boss, skipping all his phases consistently when matching in Tokyo, where in other locations I've had people who have no idea what they're doing or what the mechanics even are, leading to wipes. But never mind that. It's the fact that this structure just doesn't work quite the same with missions that are this short and this formulaic. In Monster Hunter, hunts at least take anywhere from 7 to 30 minutes. It's an involved affair where you decide to jump in, and because of that, the constant repetition and farming for upgrades feels much better, because these long fights contain plenty of surprises and adaptations as you continue to learn and become better at the game. And when you switch that over to these fights that can be so repetitive and so scripted, it doesn't hold up the same. And yes, I am aware that the masters of Monster Hunter have boiled down certain hunts to a science, basically in the same way as these fights here, and they manipulate the encounters by stunning, sleeping, and trapping monsters in a perfect loop where the monster does nothing. But that is for people looking for that, and I think it's an achievement in itself because the game isn't designed to function that way. Most people either aren't looking for it or don't even know it's possible. In Relink, this repetition is your only option, and at basically every level in the game. If you at least told me there's 70 unique fights, so jumping into random queue would be a surprise with the mechanics and you might forget what a certain enemy does, but there's a very limited pool of bosses, around 25. Some of them have other stronger powered up phases, but they function the same. Others just have elemental recolors that don't change pretty much anything. Then there's stuff like the elemental dragons. Those actually do change quite a lot, so I did count them in that 25. The point is, it won't take you very long to memorize everything, meaning that you really just repeat the quest, hoping for the rare drops you need to min-max your character, or to try out other characters, but the actual combat loop won't ever change. It gave me vibes of farming Narwa over and over again, back during the first Monster Hunter Rise update, where instead of feeling like I was mastering that fight, I was just mindlessly repeating it, and then I began questioning my life choices. Now, this repetition, as I've said, can be fun. I don't think it's offensive or something. It's just not the type of repetition I would prefer if I'm going to be doing something for hundreds of hours. There's something to be said about this very structured nature present in these fights, since people love speedrunning and maximizing uptimes and efficiency, and so do I. But this is just a tad bit too predictable and a tad bit too shallow for me. I love the feeling of learning an opponent's moves, its options, the ideal reactions and resource management in order to counter anything they could do, and feeling like I have mastered the fight. But that process in Monster Hunter is long. It requires attention and grinding and studying the fight. If you then want to attempt it with a different weapon, it requires a lot of practice and learning to master that weapon to apply the strengths of it to each of the different monsters. And it's always a satisfying thing to do. And that doesn't happen in Relink, where many fights can be boiled down to an optimal science on the first go, and few things can ever derail you from that. Similarly, when I jump into a dungeon, a boss, or a raid in Final Fantasy XIV, I'm signing up for a 10 to 15 minute experience at the fastest. And while it might be easier to see the similarities between Granblue and an MMO from afar, there's a lot more that goes into repeating your daily dungeons or raiding in an MMO. Yes, there are mechanics and clear telegraphs, and often you can script out an entire fight with how predictable they are, and it's part of the appeal. But what keeps it engaging is a combination of things. Firstly, the importance of each role in doing their jobs, and how any mistake or miscalculation can lead to the timeline of rotations falling out of sync, and now you have to adapt, and how each member needs to cover for others' mistakes as the entire chain starts to shift into a backup strategy, and everyone needs to be prepared to adjust their rotations to work in different timings to mechanics and attacks. And this happens almost always. This means that the satisfaction of an entire party perfectly executing an encounter is something that many will never experience, but if you do, there's a brilliant sense of satisfaction in doing so. Everyone did everything perfectly for the whole 10 to 30 or more minutes, but the excitement comes from how the cascading effects of each mistake interact with everyone to pull out ahead in the chaos and find a way back on track. When you don't have these defined roles, this entire system in the back end, and instead you have what you have in Relink, with these short missions and forgiving mechanics, it becomes a much less exciting experience in the moment to moment. You simply learn your rotation, whoever else is with you can indeed impact things. There are character combinations that will dish out more stuns or have more crowd control that will allow you to do different things in a fight. And if you were truly trying to get a perfect run, you need to coordinate with that and with buff times and know when the big attack should come to stagger enemies. It's a whole thing. But the difference will be at most a minute unless we're talking about the last fight. And sure, a minute is a lot when fights can be on average 3 minutes long, but it's also not that big of a deal before you go back to the queue. This isn't the difference between outright failing the mission and succeeding like it would be in an MMO. And I personally don't want Relink to be an ultra-punishing, super deep experience like that, which requires constant communication and practice. But I think it's worth pointing out that while it contains many elements of the genre, it doesn't really implement them in a way that makes them engaging. I still think it's fun as heck to use a character that's basically a black mage in these faster multiplayer boss fights, but it doesn't take advantage of this beyond it being an interesting character to play in fun but simple fights. And before I'm attacked about this, yes, indeed, the endgame fights, like the last 4, are kind of like this. They do contain more strict things to succeed, but that's only at the very end. And just to touch on a little bit more detail about the depth or lack thereof in characters, well, there's a lot of great inspiration, and there's great rewards for skill here. Things like having your 3 dodge limit reminds me a lot of Bayonetta's 5 dodge limit, and it has perfect dodges and the perfect parries, and those are very heavily rewarding things that require skill to execute. But there are characters that are deeper and characters that aren't. For something that, especially starting off and playing as your captain, which is Gran or Jita, feels closer to a light Devil May Cry. I feel most of the interesting characters for this game are the ones that drink more from the RPG cup than the action cup. Io, who I already mentioned, or Rockham, who manages a heat gauge with his skill rotation to max out damage, or Id, who has a very traditional build-up into payout as you do a first rotation, transform, do a second rotation, and transform again, and none of the transformations are really that deep because the optimal efficiency comes from transforming often to get to that payout, but it's unique and fun. The more standard characters, your sword users, all have their own stuff, but they usually use some sort of buff or charge mechanic, a secondary bar, something that can empower their abilities, anything to that effect. They always have a twist that makes them very unique, but they all use very basic combos. You do get access to a launcher, but your air combos or juggles aren't really a thing. There's nothing really technically demanding, except maybe timing some button presses correctly, or remembering some longer strings, but there's no craziness like you're playing Devil May Cry 4. It's all pretty good, and the enormous variety helps, but don't expect it to be close to the depth of technical knowledge required for character action games, nor the depth in using a limited moveset like you would in Monster Hunter. There are characters, like the main one I played, Cagliostro, which I'm a fan of because I play the character a lot in the fighting game Granblue vs. Rising, and she is basically a Dynasty Warriors character. She has 4 normal attacks, and you can press Y after each of them for a different ender to the combo, and each ender has different strengths and weaknesses. She also has a ranged attack that she can charge up, and that's it. You repeat this on loop while using your spells with some excellent support skills available to her, which, again, feels very much like an MMO type of design, where normally in MMOs you keep support's offensive options powerful, but simple, because as a support, you need to be paying attention to the rest of the map and to what your teammates are doing, and adjust in order to support them and heal them or resurrect them. But there are some other characters that are excellent and shine even brighter towards endgame. If you like complex combos with perfectly timed button presses, you have things like Narmaya or Siegfried. If you like smashing things with a hammer or a halberd, Vayne is immensely fun to play and pretty complex. But he also has a skill that creates an invincibility field, and that will let the entire party skip mechanics. There's characters like Fairy, who will pump out tons of stun and damage while being a good support, and she has an excellent super skill for maximizing damage windows. Then there are characters like Lancelot, who, while very easy to pilot, basically you press one button a lot until you dodge with other button, he has skills that freeze the enemy, allowing you to bypass mechanics entirely when timed correctly. There is a lot to love in many different flavors, and I'd be surprised if someone didn't find something to love here. And with the DLC characters on the way, if what you want is not in the game yet, it probably will be soon. And all of these characters, I think, are very well designed, even if they aren't the deepest in the world, both from that design and because of what they interact with. And the reason I think this is such an interesting thing to discuss and think about is that while there are some big underlying problems in the game that come from this mishmash of different identities and systems, namely the time wasting and the lack of engagement in moment-to-moment gameplay. Well, yes, you are chasing your next big upgrade, but you're chasing it to do the same gameplay, which isn't really that great sometimes. But this isn't a teardown of the game, it's an analysis. These are areas where this mishmash left me and can leave people wanting more or something different. And they're cool to analyze because this is such a strange game. A refreshing one. It's a strange combination of ideas. And it's worth wondering why they took which elements from each inspiration and not others, or why they went more in one direction than the other. The final result is a compelling yet often frustrating progression, with a very fun, if short-lived and repetitive core gameplay. But that's where that confused feeling I've been talking about comes from, where it doesn't take advantage of all the things it draws from. It doesn't truly combine them well, but it shines incredibly bright in the pockets where those things either do combine or where their combination is not relevant. But overall, it feels lacking in cohesion, lacking in content, lacking in direction. And that does lead to questions like, Why choose the Monster Hunter style progression if this style of gameplay doesn't lend itself nearly as well to this constant repetition? And the thing is, this is still a game that spawns from a gacha franchise. And I'm going to say something that I know many people will hate me for. It kind of is a gacha game. You see, in gacha games, it's not about intricately deep mechanics and moment-to-moment gameplay. It's about pure stat pumping with some big jumps at certain points for your power level, normally in the form of very strong passives. Gacha games rely on the strength of the experience as it is, in just repeating the same encounter, identical, over and over again. But be it through becoming so powerful that you can autoplay it, or because pressing basic buttons is so fun, it's so flashy, it contains so much of a dopamine hit that it stays engaging enough for people to push through and continue repeating it until the next milestone or the next pull on the gacha banner. I spent an inordinate amount of time last year preparing for a video that I just couldn't do back then, where I wanted to review 5 popular gacha games to see if they were good games. And it's surprising just how good they are. I didn't play Genshin or Granblue, but I did play a lot of Honkai Star Rail, and that fits this description I'm giving perfectly. In gacha games, if you can't progress because you're lacking numbers, you can compensate with skill and strategy, but more often than not, you simply need to grind. And that's what Relink has. Instead of doing it with dailies, you just have to keep grinding on loop. But because this is a premium $60 game with more complexity and skill expression, that system that seems taken from gacha games stands out even more, but it does retain that constant dopamine rush. And that's the really interesting part. For all the failings it has when adopting those other systems from other games that I've been talking about, it makes up for it in the sugar rush thrill ride of color and flashing numbers and fantastic feedback you experience each moment. Even if you know exactly what you're getting yourself into. Even if you are grinding the same exact encounter for the 30th time, and it's going to play out almost identically as the last 29. It's something you end up doing happily because it utilizes every single trick in the addictive mobile game playbook to get your neurons firing with every hit stop, flash of color, or collection of damage numbers to pop up. And it uses those techniques to keep you engaged until you get your next big upgrade and want to repeat the loop again. I'm just not sure that they really nailed the pacing on distributing those rewards, even if they did nail the dopamine rush part. As an interesting note, before I ever made a YouTube video, I remember a video by Adam Millard, the architect of games on YouTube, where he spoke about the brilliance of Vampire Survivors, a game and now a whole genre that I love and I think will be massively influential in the future. And in this video, he spoke about how the secret sauce to it all was the constant visual feedback of damage numbers popping up on screen, which give context to the flurry of carnage and incremental improvements throughout a run. And it adds so much to the overall loop and feedback to keep you engaged. Much like the slot machines that the creator of Vampire Survivors used to work on before he made the game. And yes, I am paraphrasing him a little, I didn't go back to watch the video, but that's okay. Relink does the exact same thing, but at a different scale and with a lot more systems surrounding it. But your progression from hitting 2,000 on a single hit to hitting 200,000 on a big explosion makes every part of your brain feel good. The way the health bars go down, the mode and stagger bars going up, the way that everything has this responsive feel just keeps you hooked and pressing buttons, and it's all been very carefully designed to make you feel how you feel. When this sort of thing is used in gacha games, which as I mentioned before are often similar in quality when it comes to these aspects, people say that it's terrible and designed to create addiction. But that's a very slippery slope to go down, because in premium games like Relink and Vampire Survivors, it's not intended to make you part with your money, it's intended to make you feel good when playing a video game. In one of the candidates for a channel t-shirt with how often I repeat it, context matters. But one of the things that this game inherits from gacha games that isn't a cause for celebration is its insistence on the grind being painful and excessively time-consuming. And this is bad. This is my biggest complaint towards the game. Also, starting now, unmarked endgame spoilers, so beware. As I mentioned before, you need the pure raw stats to really enter the endgame. And the endgame, thanks to the length of some of the fights, is where a lot of the fun happens. Sure, they still follow the same formula. The enemies don't magically become complex and provide you fights that have more freedom. They don't become dynamic. They just are a little bit harder and longer. And they do demand you now to optimize better to really clear them or farm them efficiently. But the way that the progression necessary to reach this point is gated is terrible. One of my main complaints with Granblue Relink is that you're either so strong that the combat is trivial and repetitive, or too weak and it feels like an uphill battle. And also the hill is made of mud, and it's raining. And all of this mostly boils down to how requirements and rewards are distributed, because if you ever do a fight right at the level you're supposed to with a party that is around the same level, you will have a blast. Progression in the game is gated by about 20 different things, as is normal in gacha games and Monster Hunter as well. It's just that Monster Hunter is better designed to respect your time than this game, and you know how serious the issue with Granblue is when I'm saying that Monster Hunter respects your time. Characters level up from experience, but what truly matters is filling out your mastery charts, which require mastery points. These can be grinded as rewards for quests and a million other things. Aside from your mastery, you have your weapons and your sigils. Weapons are stat sticks, of course, but they need to be upgraded, and then once reaching certain level thresholds, they need to be uncapped to continue leveling. You need a type of material for upgrading, and then a list of materials that gets increasingly more rare and longer to uncap them. But you want to max out every weapon for a character, because each weapon unlocks passive stats once they're upgraded. And you'll also need even more special drops once you're done maxing out all your weapons, since the final weapon, which is a random drop from the final boss, can be ascended, gaining further stats, but requiring what is essentially 10 more uncapping processes, but without needing the upgrade materials anymore. Sigils are equipable skills, and the sigils themselves can be random drops, and they can be stronger or weaker or combine different skills in one sigil. But even when obtaining great sigils, you also need to upgrade them, and the materials for powerful late-game sigils are just as rare as the uncapping weapons. You also need to farm the meta sigils, with the most important ones being gated behind repeating the final boss over and over again, and hoping not only that the sigil drops, but that it drops with a good roll on the secondary skill. And you ideally need 4 of these, and that's if you only want a good loadout on the character you play online. If you wanted to create a full offline party, well, now you gotta do it 3 more times. Now, I don't know the drop stats, but I've beaten the final boss 56 times at the moment, and I've gotten it to drop twice. One of them was absolute garbage, so not very good odds. 2 of the other strongest sigils can only come from curios, which is a random pull. You get 1 pull for a curio after any quest past a certain difficulty. And you want to get a War Master sigil, which I do have, and 4 supplemental damage sigils with a good extra roll if you can. I've never seen a normal supplemental damage sigil in 400 pulls, and according to people that use cheats to check drop rates, the odds of getting 1 good supplemental damage sigil with a good roll on it is about 1 in 18,000. Now, you don't need these things. They're nice to have, they're big buffs, they maximize your damage, but they feel unattainable, and that's not good because these are the late game things you're supposed to be chasing. So let's imagine just for a second that you want to max out every character in the game, even if it is sharing the sigils. Generally speaking, uncapping and sigil materials are rare drops from the staple enemies. If you just did around 12 or 13 fights, and you did each of those 13 fights 20 times each, you could upgrade a lot of stuff, but it's still around 250 quest clears, and that requires you to have good luck on the drops in all of the fights. But then you also need currency, so you'll probably want to run the most gold or rupee, as in the case of this game, efficient quest, and you'll want to do it around maybe 200 times, at around 4 minutes apiece for a comfy 6 to 7 hours, to have enough rupees to max some stuff out. Oh, but none of the quests you've been doing reward you the material needed to upgrade weapons, which are fortitude crystals. So you can either spend another 20 hours farming those to max out 4 or 5 characters, or use some AFK strategy before the developers patch it out and leave the game running for 40 hours while checking up on it from time to time since you can't leave it running AFK forever, and you can't hold infinite materials. Oh, and each character wants to get their own unique character sigils, which enhance or improve certain core parts of each character, and the ideal signature sigils are gated behind a different mechanic that requires vouchers, which also have an entirely separate optimal grind where you farm a mission against generic soldiers to trade in their drops for vouchers, and after using those vouchers to roll on normal sigils, once you do it enough, you'll get access to a super roll, which has a chance to give you one of these signature sigils, you don't know which or for which characters, and it could also give you something pretty good or just generally garbage. And again, this is a completely separate optimal grind that you will basically not progress unless you're looking to farm it. And farming it does not provide progress for anything else. And the gameplay for the farm is as exciting as watching grass grow. If the rupee payouts were higher, if the quests generally provided fortitude crystals, or if both of those currencies were just eliminated, it'd be a much smoother and less frustrating experience. Having all of these different currencies per se isn't bad, and it's the norm in stuff like Monster Hunter, and Gacha games and MMOs as well. But in those games it's balanced a lot differently. Relink feels particularly stingy, and like the game wants you to waste your time repeating low-level quests that the game clearly marks as the most efficient ones to farm these materials, but it provides little to no progression to any other progression system when you do it. In general, I think that if people need to figure out a way to leave the game AFK to farm things, and more importantly, when even I resort to it, that's not very good. If I needed to farm for 2 hours to get enough fortitude crystals for the whole game, it'd be fine. I'd still think it's dumb and unnecessary, much like things like money and potions require certain farming routes in Monster Hunter, but they really don't require more than a couple hours to have enough for the whole game. At least that was the case when I did it with Rise. But what Relink asks of the player is needlessly absurd for time dedicated to something with the engagement factor of watching paint dry. To test this, I did the AFK strategy for 3 hours, and I got enough fortitude crystals to level 3 weapons up to 150. And there's 6 weapons per character, but one of them is a slightly different thing, so let's ignore that. Let's simplify it. You need at least 1 hour per weapon. For 6 weapons, that's 6 hours. Let's say that if instead of being AFK, you actually play the game, and it's half. So you need 3 hours per character to have enough of the upgrade material for weapons, which are required to progress and reach maximum power. And that translates to a conservative 60 hours of playing to max out the character weapons. This doesn't include mastery points, rupees, or any of the materials necessary to uncap each of those weapons at each of the stages where you need to uncap them. Because the optimal way to farm the weapon upgrade material is a mindless mission that doesn't give drops that are useful for anything else. And if you try to do this passively by farming other materials, like by doing boss quests or the final boss, which is the one you want to farm the most, those missions don't drop any upgrade material, so you'll either get very little or none depending on the one you choose. This is straight up disrespectful to the player's time, not because of the amount of hours, but because of how mindless the content and gameplay becomes during those hours. As flashy as it may be, as fun as it may be, the same thing done for 6 hours with no variation becomes tedious work. Like I should be getting paid to do it. And if this were World of Warcraft, I would probably be getting paid to do it. I understand that this was done either because it's a formula that works in gacha games or because they were overconfident in the strength of their game to allow for this repetition, while padding out the length or to just extend the playtime. No matter the reason, it's a mistake. And even though, as I said, you don't need these things to beat the game, they are the reason to keep playing once you're technically done with it. It's to max out every character, to achieve the best build, but they're locked behind so many different time-consuming systems that while you're wasting your time and your mind drifts because the content is so vapid that you don't need to pay attention to the game anymore, you will find yourself asking, why am I doing this again? Oh, right, to have my character do more damage. And why do I want to do that again? Oh, to say I did it and to farm things more efficiently. There's just not enough reward compared to what is asked of you, where in other games, that's not the case. It's a balance of the carrot on the stick being so appealing, plus the things you are doing being engaging enough. For me, hunting in Monster Hunter is more generally engaging, and the rewards of my shiny new armor skill and testing out how that will impact the gameplay is much more appealing than my damage numbers will go up. So you might find yourself in this situation and end up turning the game off. And let's be honest, like every game before it, when they release new bosses, new missions, new characters, when a bigger DLC comes along, many of these things will be simplified or become trivial to obtain, as the developers push you into the new content and they don't want you to spend hours grinding that old content. So you might as well just turn it off now and wait for that new content to come. You don't have to max out all of your characters in anticipation of it, because when the new content comes out, they'll make that experience much faster, or at least that's how it normally works. That's how it works in gacha games. That's how it works in MMOs. So why would we expect it to be different here? And balance really is the key word, because that balance needs to be achieved. And in this case, the balance between an endless treadmill of despair and an attainable end goal for the game is not really met. Currently, you decide when to stop playing the game out of boredom and repetition. Well, I mean, technically, like all games. But what I mean to say is that there's no real motivating factor to keep you playing beyond making the numbers go up or obtaining the things to have all of your characters' numbers go up. There's no ultimate end goal, no super secret final fight, and no big dramatic changes for continuing. But I do believe that if some of this excessive bloat were trimmed down, people would have a goal. Maybe they would have the goal of maxing out all their characters, rotating through them and having fun. And maybe after 200 or 300 hours, you could be finished with the game, at least for that goal that you set, and then you can just wait until the next content. Because games don't need to be, or to feel, infinite. And I don't have the answer for proper balance in progression, because it wouldn't be fun to simply get every character in the game to maximum power in 4 or 5 hours. But the journey should be more engaging, of that I'm sure, and the destination should always feel attainable. Monster Hunter suffers from this as well, but less so. And I would hope that a game like Relink that takes its cues from Monster Hunter, well, as well as gacha games, would know how to manage this better, learning from those that it takes inspiration from. In Relink, the depth of the systems and the repetition of them just don't have that hook to keep you going, and on top of that, what you are hunting for is just so damn unreachable. Monster Hunter makes that combat more engaging for longer. But on the flip side, things like MMOs can be just as bad as what we have in Granblue, but other times they aren't. Other times they respect your time more, and most of the time, they offer a wealth of other viable paths and alternatives to obtain power or spend your time, because such is the nature of the massive beasts that are MMOs. Maybe the answer to this balance problem is to simply have less of a grind, and trust that your random drops for maximum efficiency at endgame, which exist here as well with terminus weapons, is enough to keep people engaged. But no matter what the answer might be, my job is to point out the mistake, not to fix it, because if I were to fix it, I'd be making great games instead of sitting in front of a microphone analyzing them, and I'm simply not that smart. It is these confusing, frustrating decisions that also help in holding back Relink from greatness, from an instant classic, from a franchise that starts off on top. There are more confusing decisions though, things like how you obtain each character's sigil slots, where you have to watch their fate episodes, which are these voice-acted vignettes, side stories with static panels that after watching them lead to a couple of very simple side quests where you take down some enemies in the same tiny 8 maps you've been to a dozen times before. The stories can be good, they can even be great, they're often funny, but the fact that they're mandatory to improve your character is baffling to me. It's a design philosophy that I hate, and it is once again very present in gacha games, these whole vignettes that give you bonus things, but in a game like this, a big full-price release, it feels like the developers thought, We made these static images, wrote this dialogue, and had the voice actors read it out. So now you are going to watch it. Forcing these things on me makes them lose value because I ended up hating the idea, as I ended up completely skipping the ones from characters I didn't care about. When if it had been presented to me as a bonus instead of an obligation, I very probably would have ended up watching them on my own terms, and I would have probably enjoyed it. And so when you combine all of these small and big decisions with the overall lack of content, the game feels lesser, and I come back to just wanting more from it. The story chapters are decent, but they're not the length, size, variety, or scale as a full-on action game. The quests are these fast and focused affairs, but they have plenty of filler, especially early on, and an awkward progression. But also just a lack of total bosses, and that doesn't help with how repetitive the game can feel, and how that eventually outweighs the cathartic joy of pressing buttons and seeing cute colors pop up everywhere with big numbers. But the systems here, the characters, the art style, the effects, the sheer glee provided by doing your combos and doing a perfect dodge and putting in your damage at optimum times, I just wish I could play more of that, and do so with less constant nitpicks. I wish I could explore this world, or fight a huge roster of bosses, or have a smoother progression, because when I'm doing the right quest at the right power level and playing the game, I love it. I think it's so much damn fun. But when I have to think about requeuing and checking which currency I'm low on, which materials didn't drop from my 10th time waiting for the griffin to land after the attack I've dodged 100 times, or remembering I need to mash through the fate episodes of a character, or that to get my next upgrade, I have to go farm slimes for rupees and then I have to farm Excavalion for 2 hours when I'm already so tired of this boss, so I do it in multiplayer to make it faster and more fun, but then the matchmaking fails for 15 minutes while constantly pinging me to reset it until there's a network error and the entire game crashes. And then I just don't open it back up. There is such potential, not only in this universe or in these characters, but in this gameplay and in the very concept of mixing these elements together in this very shiny and satisfying package. And at the very end game, it does fulfill that promise. It gives you a glimpse of what this game could be. I've spoken now at length about the tedious endgame progression, but actually playing the missions at endgame is very fun. Everything is taken to the max in endgame because the best parts of the game shine and the sore spots hurt more. The final bosses in endgame, which are the light and dark dragons, this huge robo-lizard, and proto-Bahamut, are what I think the game was aiming for. These fights feel like a perfect combination of optimizing rotations and strategy with enough chaos that it's hard to really organize for, leading to last-second dodges while keeping your rotation up, and mechanics that require the team to cooperate or lead to failure, much like an MMO fight. I mean it, I've wiped on Bahamut many times because someone just wasn't doing what they were supposed to, because it takes one moment of someone not reacting to wipe out the entire team and snowball from there. And this is fun in a way that much more directly scratches that MMO itch. Likewise, the truly chaotic fights feel like a great multiplayer action game, closer to Monster Hunter but with a more DMC flair. And there's a lot of fights in Proud Mode, which is that final difficulty rank where you fight 3 monsters at once. And these can be frustrating and difficult due to that chaos that you haven't experienced before in this game. But if you can hang, I had a blast with them. I wouldn't be surprised if these were some of the missions that people dislike the most, but for me, they added a wonderful change of pace into this pure reactionary style of fight, where I know my character and me and my team have to constantly adjust to the fight. There's no plan that you can really carry out. There's nothing that you can commit to memory like a script. You have to improvise, and that felt really fun. At the same time, the refights of the very scripted bosses like Fury Cane or Excavalion are just as slow, annoying, and follow the exact same flowchart where yes, cooperation matters, but not enough to tank the mission. Just enough to delay the otherwise very simple plan, and then you do them again but with larger health bars, and yes, just as before, they have the same mechanics and the same stuff to dodge at the same points, or sometimes they have even more. Now, for as much as there is good stuff in the endgame, it's not perfect. At this point, repeating the last boss on loop is very simple once you've got it down, and so does your team. It's just a matter of barely paying attention. and it is quite close to impossible to do with AI teammates unless they're also endgame ready, which would require many, many hours of farming, and I'm sure eventually someone will break the game enough to do the final boss solo, but it is not something that I really think is possible, and if it is, it definitely requires hundreds, if not thousands of hours of farming to do so in a reasonable time frame in order to actually farm that last boss. And that is a problem, because if you're farming Fatalis, you can do so solo. Most endgame fights in Monster Hunter that aren't the raids from World are easily doable solo. Even more in Rise, where you can take AI teammates with you if you want to, and it feels like you're learning the fight, and very rarely will it play out the same way. But here in Granblue, you cannot farm solo, and it will always succeed or fail in almost the same way, where instead of being constantly on my toes, I would simply be surprised when, because a certain damage check or optimal timing wasn't met, sometimes the boss would end up doing something different. And while this is fun, and I like fishing for the good loot and the good rolls, it gets tiring much faster than fights from other games, just because it is a optimally 3.5-minute fight where everybody does a thing and it kind of becomes very robotic after a while. And this is where I find myself both in love and disappointed with Relink. I desperately wanted this endgame grind to be less stingy. I wanted more of this superb endgame content and reasons to vary up what I do in fights. I wanted to be more rewarded for doing the fights. I want to play this game more, but it just doesn't give me the things I want. And instead it puts dumb speed bumps in the way. Oh wait, give me a second, I need to reset my AFK weapon material farm. This same game but an open world RPG, or this same game but more like Monster Hunter with open maps and monsters to hunt. This same game but an MMO with more involved dungeons, raids, and roles. This same game but without so many of the issues it has. I would spend so many hours on so many different versions of this game and do so happily. And I hope that this concept evolves in the direction it's going, or in any other they wish, because when it works, it's fantastic. It's just that this game right now is not something that I want to spend hundreds of hours on. It's a very fun game that can be frustrating. It's overall highly enjoyable, especially for those of you who this combination of ideas sounds like something up your alley. And it does the concept and description of mixing these three things together fair justice, not the most, but enough. It is a fun game for me to spend 90 hours on. And I got to endgame, I maxed out 3 characters, partially to say that I did it, and partially to keep thinking about the game and really solidify my thoughts and feelings for this review, which is still a messy review because it's just a very big and strange game. I enjoyed a good portion of that, but it's not a game that I want to jump into again. If it receives more content, more meaningful progression, new bosses, new systems, yes, I will jump in immediately, but never did it cross my mind that I wanted to do everything in the game or max out everything or get an optimal roll on everything. And those are things that I have at least attempted to do in Monster Hunter, where I've been close to having metasets for each weapon, or Final Fantasy XIV, where at one point I did have every class maxed during one of the expansions. And that's just not the case here. But with some changes, with some improvements, some redesigns, not only could it be like that someday, but it could be one of the best games to do it in. And I hope it gets there, either with this game or in a sequel, but I would love nothing more than that. Because that's what I want in the end. More of this and better. And hey, to cut it some slack, it's the first time they try and do this. So, if anything, it shows tremendous potential for what they could do on a second go-around or as new content comes out. Because this is just absolutely incredible in how much it manages to pull off on a first go. And I do want you to keep in mind, like I've said many times, I recommend this game. And it might be the game for you. I stopped after 90 hours and I definitely feel like I got my money's worth, but maybe for you, you'll be motivated to go for 300. Maybe you're a person who just finishes the main story in Monster Hunter and you'll reach Proto-Bahamut in this game and then you'll put it down and be happy. I don't know. I'm not you. But I do think that there is a lot to love in this game. So I strongly encourage you to try it out. Sure, there's a lot to think about, and you will have pain points throughout your playthrough. More or less depending on your experience, your matchmaking, a ton of stuff. But it's a really good game. And it might just be something that you love, and there's really nothing else that matters at the end of the day except spending your time on something that makes you happy. I hope that in the future, Granblue Relink goes from a game that I love and I would love to play more of, but is ultimately just a little bit too frustrating for me to enjoy, into something that is magnificent and a true competitive entry in a genre that really doesn't have many of them. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, remember to hit the like button. And if you think I've earned it, make sure to subscribe. I do big analysis like these very often, as well as news and coverage of games and the industry and smaller essays around there. You can just check out the channel and figure it out. If you do leave a comment, which you should, make sure to sneak in big flashy numbers, as words, not as numbers, into your comment. And that way I know that you made it to the end of the video, and I'll heart every comment that does so, because you guys here at the end are the true champions. Know that I value your time, and it's a privilege that you've chosen to spend some of it on this video with me. I've been Mug Thief, and as always, I'll see you all very soon.